Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, depending on where you are on this fast forward planet, still wrapped in a pandemic, which is uh, at this hopeful stage in the United States of possibly ending its surge, which has never been a series of surges. It's really one long rise when you look at it with a long time scale. We're a planet wrapped in climate challenges. Both vulnerability and exposure to climate are soaring and surging, and the climate system itself is changing. Today, we're going to have a session on what people do in response to climate change, what they're doing in response to everything else that's happening, again, in fast forward on this connected planet where mobility is a human norm, but the impediments to sort of managed mobility, managed pathways toward resilience and limiting human rights impacts and the like, there are enormous challenges going forward. And climate change is essentially accelerating those questions. The story today is on Sustain What, this weekly webcast is stop debating climate causality or dislocation causality so much and start enhancing climate mobility. What can we do to flip the script and do more around the world to foster that capacity for people to be responsive? And a lot of this relates to a focus here at the Earth Institute at Columbia University on the broader concept of managed retreat. And that, I'll show you what we mean by that. You'll meet our guests in a second. Two are here. And just to get quickly at this, how this issue has become confused and raucous in the media and even in the policy sphere, terms like migration and refugee and dislocation and the role of climate change as opposed to climate vulnerability is also often mashed up. There was a recent paper that came out by a bunch of academics led by Ingrid Boas and others, aiming to dispel climate migration myths by building a new research agenda around climate mobility. What does that mean? What do you foster? What do you measure? What do you work on? And they also had a piece in The Conversation, which if you Google for Ingrid Boas's name, the words climate migration myths, you can find that. But that's just one indicator of the dynamics out there right now. My own journey on this started in 1988 when I was diving deep into climate change for the first time. The same year the IPCC, that SAGE organization, was launched. That's when I did my first cover story on global warming. I think 6,000 words, much of which I've been repeating for a couple thousand times in different formats ever since. And there, we had a picture of Bangladesh as kind of the poster child for people having to move in the face of extreme weather hazards. 2007, I wrote a piece on what I proposed was the new population bomb is more of a population cluster bomb. Jesse Osabel and Joseph Chamy, demographers and development analysts, were saying we live on a world of exploders and imploders in nations with high fertility rates and those with negative population. And so you're going to have people on the move, economic opportunity, stress, all the complexities there. And then at Columbia now, as I said, a year ago when I joined here, they had the first meeting on managed retreat, which is, again, broader than this migration issue we'll talk about today. Managed retreat is what do we do when parts of the world would be fundamentally uninhabitable, either because they're underwater or the heat extremes will be not easily survived. And to me, managed retreat implicitly includes moving people and things in managed ways. And that's why Lisa Thalheimer and Gustavo Macedo and Michael Doyle, who'll be with us in a few minutes, will be able to illuminate how do you fill in that gap? What do we actually do on this changing planet? A big point, too, is clarifying terms. And we'll talk about that in a few minutes. I'm going to just play one little clip here that I think illustrates the problem. Michael Oppenheimer is a great friend of mine. He's at Princeton now. I've known him literally 40 years since I was first digging in on this stuff in the early 80s. But he said something here that I think is a little simplistic.
We know what's going to happen as climate change gets worse. People reluctantly are going to have to leave their homes and they're going to go elsewhere. They're going to migrate. And we know what the consequence of that will be because we see it around us every day. It's not a pretty picture. climate refugee is someone who's moving away from the coast, decided to pick up and leave because they've seen too many floods and their home has been wiped out. A climate refugee is a farmer in a country where it's gotten too hot and too dry and they can't subsist anymore.
So you get the idea. I think some of our guests might have some issues with that framing of climate refugee as opposed to the other issues we'll talk about today. And again, a lot of well-meaning people could benefit from a little bit more depth of understanding of some of these issues, which is why we're having this broadcast today. I'm Andy Revkin at the Earth Institute, been here for a year after all these decades of journalism. And great to see that Michael Doyle has joined us as well. Perfect timing, Michael, who you'll learn in a minute has been at something critically important, even setting aside climate change, on a planet with so much interconnectedness and mobility enabled by global economic and transportation links. We're in a world of people on the move, and he's building a proposed mobility convention, essentially, and we'll talk about that in a second too.
We know what's going to happen.
Sorry, let me move forward here. Oh, and just one last little introductory element. So what do we do? What does a better conversation look like? How do we avoid misusing terms, whether we're journalists or scholars or the public or policymakers? What are the paths forward? And Michael, I'd love to start with you at that broad scale. You're a university professor, that most esteemed assignation at Columbia University. You have really deep understanding of the core background issues here. And why does the world need a mobility convention? I think would be a first great question, if you could tackle that a little bit.
Sure. Thank you, Andrew, and apologies for being late.
No problem.
I had various computer issues, things I needed to download in order to catch up with this advanced technology.
Okay.
So apologies. I think this is a vitally important question. We have various different rules for the movement of migrants, which tends to be at the discretion of a national government. Some regions have rules of relatively free movement, such as the EU does. And we have other rules that govern refugees in the world. But even these sets, if a migrant is someone that the UN thinks of as somebody who is resident in a country not their own for a year, and a refugee is someone who fits the 1951 convention definition of someone being persecuted on race, religion, nationality, social group, political opinion, we leave out a whole other group of people who are internationally mobile. They're on the move. And it includes everyone who goes overseas in a conference to spend some time, to tourists, to overseas students, and then, of course, labor migrants, and then at the family reunification, and then at the humanitarian end, refugees and forced migrants. So a group of 40 plus academics got together a couple of years ago, including Gustavo, who is here in this group right now, a friend from Sao Paulo. And we proposed a comprehensive convention, and one that was also cumulative. It comprehensive and it covered all of those categories. And cumulative, it worked on the insight that if you're visiting a country to go to a conference or as a tourist, you need some rights to be protected and guaranteed, your basic freedoms of speech, etc. And if you get in a medical emergency, medical attention, or access to the courts, but you're not going to have a right to get a job. You're not going to have a right to vote. On the other hand, as you change the various statuses, you need additional rights that build upon those basic ones. Until the point that you're a refugee, you need all of the rights that have been denied to you in your home country. And it makes sense to put together a comprehensive package because there are synergies that make the protection of these rights work better. Let me stop there, but that's what we've been trying to do over the past couple of years.
And this is all with the goal eventually, I assume, of having an actual convention. Right now, it's a model. It's like the model UN. It's just different than the model UN, perhaps. Right. And, people that think about that first time.
Could I also mention, that we're not pie-eyed, ridiculous optimists. We really do think that it's the people who gathered to put this together that it'll take 15 to 20 years of real campaigning with civil society, NGOs, urban mayors, religious groups, the private sector, to persuade governments that this kind of a comprehensive reform is worth doing.
And that's a great starting point. So that's clarifying paths and conventions and relationships between countries and sectors of society. New science is also in the mix too. So Lisa Thalheimer, I think you're the only person I know on Twitter or LinkedIn whose title is Climate Migration Modeler. And actually, a minute ago, Michael mentioned that there's a gradation of causality and results and individuality here. Could you just talk about what do we need to study better to get at this? Also, that paper I showed at the very beginning by that group led by Ingrid Boas, I think gets at this idea. There's a really important research agenda here.
Yeah, absolutely. First of all, thank you for having me. I think this is a great panel and, great to have various different disciplines represented. And yeah, you're right. So my doctoral thesis looks at first the attribution of extreme weather events and climate change, and then also seeing, if these extreme weather events which have displaced people has anything to do with climate change at all. Because climate change and human mobility is a pretty complex issue, as I think many people now notice. And I think it's absolutely right to go more into the realm of realizing, okay, it's about climate mobilities. It's not only migration, not only refugee flows, not only displacement, but really looking into the various different angles. To what extent does weather and climate actually play a role in, creating human responses such as mobility? And this is kind of what I do, and I think we need this kind of new science to, well, I guess, to quantify that, but also to really say, okay, this is a complex issue, and this is what we can do with science, and we obviously also need to involve people. We need to interview people. We really need to know what's happening on the ground.
We certainly do. So what disciplines are mixed here? I think you work with Robbie Parks a little bit. He's an epidemiologist, really, an environmental epidemiologist. You've got all the social sciences. So this isn't like a single discipline.
That's correct. I think I broadly combine climate econometrics. So really the kind of quantitative social science with attribution science, probabilistic event attribution, which comes from atmospheric physics and is broadly under the umbrella of climate science. So I kind of pick and choose these various different science aspects and kind of mush them together in a framework in order to try to disentangle these various different complexities of human mobilities. I especially focus on internal displacement, frankly, because there's a lot of reliable data on that type of human mobility. And it's recorded by the UN, by the Internal Displacement Monitoring Center. So there's actually kind of good quantitative data out there.
I remember my friend Tom Friedman at the times when he was working on some of these issues several years ago, he was reporting from North Africa and using, he did a piece that focused on the role of WhatsApp, even in the equivalent of coyotes at the Mexican border. There are people using WhatsApp to help in a very speedy way get the word out to community. Oh, there's boats here, blah, blah, blah. And I that also feels like it also provides a data window too. Just like if you looked at some of the maps of what happened at the Capitol protests right now using Parler data, which there seemed to be a mappable way to use some of that digital data now to track location pretty. It's not the person, but it's the idea of activity moving, which seems interesting. I don't know if that's integrated yet into this.
Yeah, definitely. I think also satellite imagery plays an important role in, getting more data without being actually on the ground. A lot of countries are conflict affected or extreme weather affected, so you can't really travel to locations which are affected, for instance, by a flood or where people are actively fleeing an extreme event. So that's actually kind of convenient to gather data and see what are the changes in land use, where are people going, and maybe finding reasons why they're going. You can see if people are going from rural areas to more urban areas, and you could, kind of interview people then and ask if they're pursuing more job opportunities or better job opportunities. If a country or region is very reliant on rain-fed agriculture, I mean, it's likely that people, migrate to the city center in order to find other jobs which are, where the income is more reliable.
Before we move forward, and going to get Gustavo in the mix here now, maybe I'll ask this question about COVID-19. I did see, Lisa, you were involved in a study with Robbie, I think, some kind of initial look at the dislocation, profound, or maybe it's actually the stoppage of, there was, in some places people stopped, but like in India, there was these mass exoduses from cities as the lockdown happened. Are there lessons from COVID-19 that apply here? Or maybe Michael too, is there, thinking about that mobility question, when there's factors like pandemic risk are there too, does that add a new lens on this, or is that different? Maybe Lisa and then Michael.
Sure. I think there's really a problem of people having to obviously kind of follow the socially or physically distancing rules set by governments. But also, if you imagine an extreme event happening, people are forced to flee that extreme event. So they can't really, be in lockdown and be kind of in the area of an extreme event. They have to flee. They have to, save their lives, their assets, their families. And so there's really kind of this how would you describe it, this discrepancy between taking care of yourself and kind of obeying the governmental rules. And I think this is kind of the added cascading risk of the current pandemic.
And Michael, just from the standpoint of the general idea of a convention, does the pandemic and what it represented both economically and for public health add urgency, or is it add complexity?
It certainly adds complexity, that's for sure. We have the standards for asylum that are built into the Refugee Convention of 1951. Persecution, race, religion, nationality, political opinion, social group. Disease doesn't immediately fit into there.
Oh, interesting.
And so, on the other hand, people could be fleeing from a region where they can get no medical attention whatsoever, and the only way they could save themselves or their families is crossing a border. So that's one level of complexity. Our regime just doesn't cover that kind of eventuality. And this was raised to me when I gave a talk at Gustavo's institution at the University of Sao Paulo by one of his students. What does your convention say about COVID? And the answer is so far nothing. That is, we need to begin to do a lot of rethinking. The second side of it, if I could just continue just one more.
Yeah, of course.
The second side of it is that we have a general view coming out of past experiences with pandemics that closing borders is a very bad idea. It further complicates any attempt for the country to recover, get access to the kind of goods that they need. And so we really need to sit down with WHO and UNHCR and IOM and rethink a number of our basic rules about how we deal with pandemics. One thing we can be pretty sure of, this is not the last pandemic the global population is going to face, and we need to be better prepared.
Absolutely. Then I'll just throw in one more wrinkle. I remember having a yellow card with my vaccination history. And so vaccination normalizing a global standard for demonstrating when you were vaccinated and all that seems to be perhaps adding some oomph to this. I don't know.
I still have the same card. It's in my wallet. When I was at the UN, they insisted that I carried it around whenever I went on foreign trips, because there were some countries that still demanded it, to look at the yellow card for access. But I think it's time to revive that too. I think you're right, Andy.
Yeah. So Gustavo, thank you for your patience, first of all. And it's great to have you here. I'm just going to forward the slide one more notch here. So integration of all of this seems to be another frontier. Getting the science in the room with policymakers, with diplomats, you know, in the case of expanding the conversation into public health with the WHO. Could you just familiarize us with your work in this area at the intersection of the science and decision making? And what does Brazil bring to this table? To the table?
Well, there's a lot. Well, first of all, Andrew, thank you very much for the invitation. Can you hear me?
Your microphone is a little suddenly. It was good a minute ago when we first joined. Could you just double check?
Can you hear me now?
It's very choppy.
Let me see why there is something happening here.
It feels like there almost is interference, giving it a little bit of a try without the headset. I'm just guessing.
Yeah.
You know, just use the microphone on the computer for a minute. Let's just see.
It's better now?
No.
No?
I have an idea. Can you disconnect completely and come back in a couple of minutes? Like just
Sure, of course.
It's usually the rule of thumb is try that, because it was fine when you first joined.
Chip.
Yeah. Same question though. Lisa, actually, interestingly, I noted you've worked a lot at IASA, which I spent time there in a 100-degree summer, maybe 5 years ago. This is near Vienna. It's the International Institute for Applied Systems Analysis. And their whole mission is to dive in on complexity and intersectionality. And that, you know, I think the Earth Institute in its own way is working at those same frontiers. But who needs to be at the table to have this all play out in a way that's most productive? That's
a great question. I would say those who think in systems, who think beyond one certain discipline and try to really incorporate complexity as, I guess, scientists, but also as practitioners, recognizing that, you know, complexities is really what we should focus on. For instance, how systemic risk driving human mobility, existing patterns of migration which get disrupted because of X, Y, and Z, and how could that, you know, if we do a fast forward in, let's say, 2050, how could that look like? So I think all these people who kind of, you know, look at complexities should be on a table, and then also discuss and kind of bring forward complexity thinking and systems thinking to policymakers. And that's obviously a huge deal, because not everyone thinks in this way. And I think there's kind of a, I guess, paradigm shift we kind of need to advocate for.
We were just having a conversation about that this morning in the context of Colombia's plan to build a climate school, which is implicitly
Alex's idea.
Integrating disciplines, breaking down path-dependent barriers and norms, and embracing complexity. Too much, I think. We'll talk about journalism in a minute. My part of this, my responsibility. You know, this was very simple. The world's getting hot. Freak out, and maybe do something, and that doesn't work. So we're trying new things in journalism as well. So Gustavo, let's see how you're doing there.
Can you hear me now?
Oh yeah.
Yes, much better. Oh,
Perfect.
Okay, great.
Perfecto.
Great. Okay.
So let's get back to we were talking about this integration question, like who needs to be in the room, and you know, if you could talk about Brazil's potential here, that's cool too.
Mm-hmm. Well, Andrew, sorry for that. Something might happen. Thank you again for the invitation. Thank you, Michael, for recommendation, Lisa, and for whoever is watching us right now. Michael, I just would like to say that I'm really happy to see you again. And also, I would like to point out that I'm really happy that we are talking in this context, right? I mean, this week is a very meaningful one for all of us. I mean, as Brazilian, as a Democrat, I'm happy to share the feelings that I suppose we are all happy with the new outcomes in the political scenario, which has a great impact in our topic, right? Things could be much different than we are going to see in the next 4 years. So, Andrew, what my perspective on this topic, and also what we can bring, the experience that we can bring from Brazil, is this. We're trying to, I mean, when I say we, and say I and a bunch of friends at the University of São Paulo, we're trying to look at the topic of mobility, bringing it together with a new perspective that we call science diplomacy. We have the science diplomacy school at the University of São Paulo. And science diplomacy, I'm not sure if you are familiar with this concept, but science diplomacy is basically trying to integrate science and diplomacy. I mean, scientists are also diplomats, and diplomats, they should rely on science more often, right? Which should be, I mean, it was supposed to be very clear, but we just saw in the last 5 or 4 years, it's not necessarily the case, either in the US, either in the UK, or in Brazil. And also, what I'm trying to do in my work is trying to integrate mobility with science diplomacy, which is bringing together different specializations inside the university. I'm not talking about just about humanities, and we are talking about biology, we're talking about medicine, we're talking about engineering, physics, chemistry. There's a bunch of people trying to work together. And the way that I'm working with it is through artificial intelligence. So I'm working with artificial intelligence since last year because I'm kind of optimistic with what we can do with artificial intelligence. I believe that from the humanities, we have neglected artificial intelligence for a few years. There is no space for doing the same in the future. And this is more or less the perspective that we have at the University of São Paulo. We have the Institute of International Relations, which has a very traditional approach on the topic, migration, refugees, and so on. What we're trying to do is mix a little bit our own perceptions, the way that I was educated. So this is a challenge for me because I'm trying to change my mindset when I'm trying to work. I sent you the piece that I wrote with a friend of mine. She's an ecologist. So we are trying to work together with different areas and trying to hear from our friends from across the building how we can think about migration or mobility and so on.
And when you think about the role of AI, machine learning or data analysis using that, what's the way to? Is there an example that comes to mind, like a for instance? Where do your eyes light up when you think about how that technology can apply?
Oh man, there's so many. I mean, you have to stop me if I start talking about. But I can give you just a few examples. The first one, the article that you mentioned about the nature on changing the concept that we have on climate migrants. It has 6 recommendations, right? One of the recommendations is we have to pay attention to local knowledge. Okay, so locals, they are the specialists. Not us from the university, and we don't have to tell them how to behave or how to move or so on. They are the specialists, and what we have done so far is that we have neglected their voices. Right? Artificial intelligence, if done right, okay, I'm trying to get an optimist perspective on AI. So if done right, this is a way that you can program machine learning mechanism to gather the information. When we talk about information, and we're talking about data and then information, then knowledge, right? So from language, from mobility, from season, from animals and plants, and change this kind of information into a very comprehensive one to our topic. For instance, in Brazil, we have the Amazon. In the case of the Amazon, we have indigenous people that they just move across borders. They have always done so for different reasons. I mean, sometimes for cultural reasons, sometimes for nourishment, sometimes for conflict among them. And they know better how to deal with their situation when we're talking about climate change, if you want to mention that. Another example, and then I might sound a little crazy, so if I sound a little crazy, you can stop me there.
No.
We are already thinking about space colonization. Especially in the US, you have the SpaceX, you have NASA, and you have a bunch of other enterprise seriously talking about space colonization.
Right.
One of the results might be that with the space colonization, we might watch a need for unification in Earth. There might be no need for countries anymore if you are dealing with other worlds. So in terms of trying to design a new model, a future model, we are also considering how can, in the perspective and projecting the future on space colonization, we can rethink our own ideas of the need for borders. The new border now is Earth per se. Right. It's not an artificial country. So those are just two examples that I can mention. I have others, but those are a few of them.
Yeah, so John Lennon comes in here. Imagine there are no countries. I think you're onto some very valuable concepts. A friend of mine, Steve Brumby, who I was working with at National Geographic Society, is moving into this very similar arena, World Resources Institute as well. And at Columbia, there are initiatives that are very much focused on new approaches to data analysis that might be helpful here. Maybe, Lisa, do you want to react to that provocation? Or maybe it doesn't feel like a provocation at all. Maybe it feels like a yes.
No, I think I'm personally very excited about AI and how we can, make certain processes more, less manual and tedious, and really, I guess, play a bit with technology as well. Really using that field and think broader, think more in a complex and a systematic way. I think I'm all for what Gustavo mentioned, and I think it's a great opportunity as well to bring together various different disciplines to really rethink how we think and kind of the patterns we think, like kind of like patterns of migration. Is this really still valid, a certain concept which was valid, like let's say even 10 years ago? Or how can we refine that? And what kind of technologies and what kind of concepts from different scientific fields can we use for that? So I'm quite optimistic, but I also see a lot of challenges. Having the same kind of language, communicating with each other. What do we mean when we say, for instance, forecast-based financing, just as an example, anticipatory action, humanitarian action? It's actually a term which kind of sounds a bit more from the financial sector, but it is taking weather forecasts and making decisions based on these weather forecasts, before a disaster comes actually and hits the ground. And I think even this is kind of shows me that we can think beyond and kind of anticipate what's happening. So I think AI is a perfect example for that this year.
That reminds me of other work. This is where geographers come in really handy too. There's a couple of geographers who've refined a way to use data on where people have settled and built and invested against data on climate risk. And they call it the expanding bullseye. So people can just search for the term expanding bullseye. It's a hashtag on Twitter. You'd see that many of the factors driving risk are more about exposure and vulnerability than about climate change itself. So you having that dynamic picture gives you more knobs to think about when you're looking at how to reduce vulnerability or facilitate mobility, and the like. Michael, I think some of this feels like it could interfere. We're still at a point where AI will need its own convention. If sometimes this gets at the complexities Lisa mentioned, new technology always comes with new questions. The same thing with genetics, et cetera. That might feel like another headache in that pathway from a model mobility convention to an actual concretized one, or not.
Yes, no, my reaction is that some of the research that I've seen on AI and on the interdisciplinary integration of, say, climate and economic development and political change, extremely promising. And one of the virtues of AI is the ability to, when you combine it with geographic information, to discover patterns without directly addressing and talking to people. Now, you don't want to do that solely, but
No.
It's an indirect approach. And that's quite wonderful because you can find out things that you wouldn't be able to get a hold of at the scale that you would not be able to reach. And I think that's wonderful. We're going to learn a great deal through that. We already are. There are examples out there. The only slight caution that I'd bring to bear is that there are privacy issues. The better we are at tracking people's, cell phones and other forms of movement, the more in some way we are cabining or restricting the ability to lead fully or relatively private lives. Right. And, there are always costs in new technologies and new information sources. But again, at some point, it'll cry out for a degree of responsible regulation so that individuals will have some ability to decide what they want to make public and what they prefer to keep private. I'm not underestimating the complexity of working that out because phones, as you know, are just too convenient for us. In the US, with the modern sort of electronically integrated home, I find that you can't pull the shades or turn the lights on without taking out your cell phone in some houses. So we're going to be heavily integrated in the future. And so, but there is some cost of privacy to it that I'm hoping at some point our more responsible governments get involved in thinking about what should be private and what is inherently public.
That also feels very resonant in the context of pandemic risk reduction, which implicitly involves contact tracing and testing. And there have been all these, there are parts of the world where they were much better at it because they're more invasive. China, some other Asian countries have access to data and limited. There's more of a norm in society for limits to privacy that facilitated that.
But it's not just Chinese social tracing. They've got a whole regime that's built up on that. It affects our universities too. I don't know about the University of Sao Paulo or Oxford, but we have the technical capacity to find out when students enter your class, when they enter the library. We could find out how many hours they're studying in the library every night. We have the technical capacity to do that by tracking the movement of their cell phones. And I think, that may have some good use because it helps us right now determine who is COVID safe to go into a building. That is, they've done testing recently, and that's a great advantage to us right now. But in the long run, I have some fears that in the wrong hands, and I don't include my university in the wrong hands label, but in the wrong hands, we're going to be tracked, 24 hours a day. And I'm maybe too old here, but that worries me a little bit.
No, these are big challenges, and they're not going away anytime soon. So the more that we're digging in on them early on, the better. I've had several shows here earlier in last year, I keep saying this year, last year, that were examining these very questions. At Columbia, there's CSUN has the Grid 3 project, which is doing really interesting work with, I'll just show it for a second here, data on population dynamics for understanding people's mobility and how that relates to risk, both public health and climate and the like. And if they, but as you say, this all has to be integrated with ethics and making sure there's layers of understanding of where that publicity, where the privacy issue leaves off, or how you can insulate it. I'll bring in one thing from biology. At the Times, way over a decade ago, I wrote about there's these annual normal tracking in the States of blood samples and tissue samples from hospitals. They're anonymized, so you don't attach it to an individual, but it's a way to look at trace levels of pollutants in the blood, or parts per billion of PCBs or other things, and get an idea of trends and geography without people's privacy being in the mix. So there are some traditions of that. Although again, with genetic technology, if those samples got into the wrong hands, you're definitely looking at an individual, because it's the DNA is all there. Again, it seems like there are ways to do some of this if we cobble things together and get the right heads together.
Yes.
I want to bring in another element here, and normally I would have a journalist in the room other than myself, but this kind of got pulled together quickly, and it's this. Hold on one second. Oh, good here. It's what's the role, what can journalism do, and or other communicators? We saw a few minutes ago the lead authors on that paper on climate mobilities also did a piece for the website The Conversation, which is essentially like an op-ed section that just hangs there in the web. It's a great tool, I think. So it's not just traditional reporters and journalists who are getting at this now, but what are the ways to tell the story that you feel are not yet in the mix? You're consumers of the news, and I'm sure critics of the news process quite often, given your depth of understanding. Back in July, we did a session with folks at ProPublica, where I used to work, who Abram Lustgarten has done a 2-year series on migration, mobility, refugees in the context of climate. And they tried their own model. Actually, if you see there on the right side, they had a projection from a model. They commissioned Brian Jones at Baruch College to help them build a model to look at projections and where people are going to move and where pressures are going to rise. There were a lot of questions about that because it didn't go through peer review. Even at Columbia, there were scientists who were concerned about the quality of the modeling. But I didn't know if you had your own sense of where the storytelling goes from here. Telling complex stories is really hard.
I'd be happy to jump in and start it. Back in the 90s, I was the peacekeeping advisor to Madame Ogata when she was the High Commissioner for Refugees. And I remember her saying a number of times that the journalists were our best friends and our worst enemies. And she was exaggerating probably in both dimensions, but what she had in mind was that if she needed to mobilize attention in a humanitarian emergency, she absolutely needed to have really good journalists out there telling the human qualities of the experience that real people were going through. And without that, she could not get the attention of the UN Security Council or of governments or of those who could provide assistance. On the other hand, the nature of journalism is that it's flighting in some way. That is, there's always a new story that could come along. And in many cases, in a humanitarian emergency, it's the follow-up that really makes the difference in allowing people to get back on their feet and reestablish their own lives in sustainable ways. And for that, the journalists have often moved on to some other headline. And indeed, they're telling the public that it's all over. And that was for her both a huge benefit, that is the attention, and a huge burden because she needed that sustainable action. And the press was not reliable for that. So that was her reaction to it. And to me, observing this experience of the 90s, that was quite a powerful insight.
And I'd like to hear from both Gustavo and Lisa on this too. Again, you're also communicating directly in essays and publications. And so what's the frontier here? How do you get attention to complexity, and which I think requires sustained engagement? It's different than a headline.
Yeah, that's a good question. Most often, I will say, I personally get approached from journalists who are a bit, I would say, more or less my age, a bit older sometimes, but I guess there's a generational difference between how you think and also the willingness to understand the science behind it. Not obviously generalizing everything and anyone here, but it is kind of, I have the luxury of working on a topic a lot of people are interested in and a lot of people want to hear about, because there are so many stereotypes out there and people recognize and realize that, we should address these stereotypical claims that, climate change will lead to X, Y, and Z, for instance, mass migration. And people see and also read the science behind it and say, oh, hold on a second, this is not actually true. This is not really what's happening. So getting this kind of personal engagement and personal interest in the topic kind of leads at least journalists to reach out to me personally, but also to other climate mobility researchers. And I think that's really the interesting thing I see at the moment.
And that gets back to you being very active on Twitter too.
Yeah, that's true.
There are a lot of journalists on Twitter.
Yeah.
So, and one thing that I found is the way to engage with journalists, whether it's on Twitter or elsewhere, is not always to jump on them with like, oh, you got that so wrong, as opposed to, boy, here's a way to do it better. So yeah. Having those conversations is, do you like Twitter, in this context, do you think, or do you feel like it's been troublesome?
Twitter can be good, but Twitter can also be very negative. I think if you overuse Twitter, it's not so great, but if you use Twitter in order to do science communication, so you have, for instance, a paper out and you frame your knowledge in plain language, not in scientific language, in a language right. people understand and can engage with. That's, I think, the key to it. And if you only have a couple of, I think now it's 280, correct me if I'm wrong, signs you can use, that's quite challenging.
Oh, right.
Because obviously you want to communicate a lot in like one tiny little message. And so, threads and kind of feeds of what you can learn and why this is useful is more and more becoming a trend. And there's no proper training on that. So I feel like journalists can really help and jump on board on that. And I would be very open and keen to learn more about that.
Well, the good news is one reason I'm at Columbia at the Earth Institute is to build initiatives to do some of that training. And also to create the journalist scientist crosstalk that can lead to productive, better outcomes in the long run. I wanted to bring up some friends of mine, a marvelous organization, Global Press, are breaking new ground, I think, for journalists. They've been around for over a decade, based in DC, and it's a network of female journalists in developing countries. It's globalpress.co. They do a lot of their own training. These are women who are cultivated and recruited who become journalists through their training. And their training, I think, is something that every newsroom in the world would benefit from. Among other things, they don't rely on standardized, they don't just throw a word like climate refugee into a story. They have their style manual. As it says here, this is one of them, one page from their online style manual. Refugee. They note, first of all, they are deviating from AP style. AP is the Associated Press. It's sort of a pretty standard approach to terms. Rule, do not conflate refugees who flee in a foreign country to escape danger and internally displaced people who are forcibly displaced. They're kind of building in their journalists an understanding of don't use a term until you really know what it means, and make sure if you do use it, that you define your terms. So clarifying pathways to me It's also about clarifying language. And there may be even details in their definition that need some tweaking. I just did a whole session with them, a training session on climate risk, how to look at the world in front of you as a reporter through the landscape, through the lens of why are people at risk? And that, again, brings in all the social elements, not just climate change. People are at risk because they settled in a place that's vulnerable. They're at risk because there's no governance to help limit losses when something bad happens. So it feels like a promising model going forward. We're at that point here where we kind of look ahead, and I'd love to have you each kind of reflect maybe and offer some next steps. Like if we had another session on this in a month, hypothetically or really, who isn't in the room who could help build that out? Perhaps on the technology end. Again, I could talk to Steve Brumby, who's working a lot with the World Resources Institute on the AI role here. But what's on your list if you were thinking about a conversation to enhance the capacity for sustainable mobility on a planet in rapid change? Who are we not talking to yet? And maybe Gustavo first.
Yeah, but I want to link your last question with your previous question, and say that when we are talking about science communication, we must be concerned about how we write and who is reading us. For instance, when we all here are writing and reading on migration, political science, international affairs, and law issues. But as soon as I have to read something from a friend of mine who is dealing with climate change, it's a totally different term, a totally different topic, totally different language, that I, as a political scientist, I cannot read an article published on a top climate journal. I don't have the skills for reading it. I can read, but I cannot understand. So the first thing that I would like to mention is that we must learn how to write, or how to work with, our friends across the room. The guys just who have to cross the street. And when I wrote this piece with this friend of mine who works with climate change, it was a great challenge, because we both had to learn with the other about the terms, about how we write. Science, I like to think of science as a plural, not a singular. When we talk about science, science is like a god. When we are inside the universe, we say science, science is like a god. No, science is not like a Christian god. It's more like Greek gods. There are many gods in sciences, right? So how do we make them to talk to each other? And also, how do we communicate what we are producing? Because, Michael is certainly the best person to talk about it, but my recent experience as a professor, as a university professor, is that my students, they're not reading articles anymore. They're reading Twitters, right? So they're much more Instagram, image-driven students. Right? They don't want to read books or chapters. And I'm not saying that they are wrong. Maybe we are wrong. Maybe we are the ones who have to adapt, right? I don't want to say also that they are not going to apply an exam based on Twitter. But how can we manage to first of all, to write better, and second, to read better?
The other thing I would add to your list there is to listen better. Like journalists, you think all we do is listen, right? But historically, when I was a journalist reporting a story, I would be interviewing you, Gustavo, and waiting for you to say that quotation, that crystalline, clear thought that I can then put in a story and interpret myself. And a lot of that works, but a lot of that is actually taking us in the wrong direction because it's oversimplifying. And so journalists need to listen a lot more actively. There is a solutions journalism network that is promoting ways to, they call it complicating the narrative. So how do you build a story that intrigues people, pulls them in, that embraces complexity, that says whether it's solving the abortion debate in the United States, reducing pandemic risk, slowing climate change, and building climate resilience, you're dealing with factionalized discourse, populism, and communitarianism, and the only way through is typically, to me, more increasingly to me, not typically, is through thinking of modes of conversation that are sustainable and expandable, and get away from that me convincing you through my story what to do. And I guess what I like about the mobility, the convention, the model convention, essentially, Michael, what you're building there is a conversation, right? It's like iterative, it's directional, iterative, and expanding set of appropriate voices, figuring out how to shape something that, you know, perhaps maybe it's never done, right? I think our old idea of a treaty, even like the climate treaty process, was that you have, finally in Copenhagen, we're going to get this done, we're going to sign it and be binding, and that's gone away. So maybe in a way we're talking here about a new mode of conversation, sort of constructive conversation going forward in time, engagement as necessary. Does that feel?
Yeah, if I could jump in on that's exactly right. 40 of us put together the 1.0 version, but we're already at a 2.0 version. And I just mentioned a moment ago that one of Gustavo's students confronted us with the absence of the element of public health in the framework of pandemic disease, not covered. So there has to be a 3.0. And if it has any value to it, it has to be dynamic. It has to grow. We have to build a network. And the academics have played a strong role in putting this all together. But the next set of conversations, to go back to your other point about who needs to be in these conversations, in addition to, the four of us speaking from the university, we really need to get in the mayors of cities who are much more progressive than other governmental bodies, because they deal with real people every day in their cities whom they want to be healthy, employed, law-abiding, sending their kids to school. There's a wonderful practical ethos to a good mayor. And then the other groups I'd bring in would be religious leaders, because they have often been way at the forefront in terms of protection. And then lastly, but not lastly, I bring in the private sector. There are a number of big companies, some of whom have caused a lot of trouble, needless to say, for migrants and others, but others who have positioned themselves on the front lines of offering support and solutions. And, some surprising places like IKEA and Uniqlo. These are companies that have stepped up to say that they live in a global world and recognize some responsibilities to the most vulnerable folks who are out there. So mayors, private sector, religious leaders need to join we academics in planning a better future for the movement of people across borders, in my opinion.
Fantastic. Well, you've all laid out, and we'll get, Lisa, you're going to have the final word here. We've laid out, I think, a real agenda here for how do you work on those models. I think at Columbia too, the AC4 folks, who deal with complexity, conflict, and cooperation, knowing you're never going to agree, but what do you do? That Peter Coleman's model there, I think, is invaluable in thinking about these ideas too. In fact, the Solutions Journalism Network, that story on complicating the narrative that Amanda Ripley wrote for them, she went to the Difficult Conversations Laboratory that Peter Coleman runs, which just the idea of a Difficult Conversations Laboratory feels like a vital, expandable tool in thinking about how to go forward. So Lisa Thalheimer from Oxford, thank you so much for your time. And do you have a last takeaways, going away mandate? What do we work on?
Oh, that's an honor. Thank you. I think, just adding a bit, I think cities really do play an important role, and there's the C40 initiative. And I think building upon such a great, initiative, which is already out there, and really making sure that displacement due to extreme weather events, but also, voluntary migration, voluntary human movements are considered under such an initiative, I think is really crucial, especially when we think ahead of, more extreme events occurring, more heat waves affecting people's health, people obviously wanting to have employment, and if they can't get to their job site or work site, what's going to happen then? If they're sending back remittances to their families, and that's disrupted, you obviously have more cascading risks, systemic risks even, and kind of these compounding vulnerabilities, existing ones and those coming together at the same time. So I think it's really crucial to not have silo thinking, but really bring together various different people and really try to streamline a way forward and work on that.
Boy, this is great. Well, I really appreciate having an end of the week session like this, especially after a week so momentous in shifting a tide. Hopefully it's not a surging back and forth tide, and somewhat of a forward tide toward functional democracy, sustainability in the context of how we deal with people moving on a finite planet. And we have lots of work to do, but I think there's a huge potential that's been illustrated here today. This has been Sustain What, which is a global online conversation identifying solutions to the complicated, shape-shifting, and epic challenges of humanity's great acceleration. That was the last 50 or 60 years of our experience. The Anthropocene is its other name. A prime focus is making sense of and getting the most out of the planet's fast-forward information and communication environment. It's the one Earth system changing faster than the actual environment. This webcast is produced as part of my work building Columbia University's new Earth Institute initiative on communication and sustainability. As soon as we're done, share the link you've been watching on with friends in circles far and wide. Get in touch with ideas. Look at that scrolling bar at the bottom for ways to get in touch with me. Thank you all for being here today, particularly my guests. Unfortunately, Emma Francis could not join us today. We were hoping she could, but she'll be back. And I didn't mention there's the Climate Mobility Network is one of the new Earth Institute networks here on campus. So we'll be actively pursuing these questions going forward. And again, my guests, thank you very much for being here. I will say that on Sundays, my show turns to music and the arts as a way to kind of disengage, at least briefly, from the headwork that we do here during the week. Two amazing guitarists, one 22 years old, one in his 60s, and a Grammy nominee will be here to serenade and talk about the role of music in building better lives. So come on Sundays, come anytime, find me, and stay well wherever you are. Get vaccinated wherever you are as soon as you can. We'll figure out those communication challenges in the weeks ahead. Take care. Have a good weekend.